June 1967. Newsroom of the Cumberland Valley Gazette, Pennsylvania. Reporter Wendell Hargrove sat at his typewriter, reading through his feature story one final time before sending it to print. The town that defied the odds. The headline carried that quintessentially American optimism, the kind that sold papers and made readers feel proud of their country. The article told the remarkable story of how Ashford Creek, a tiny town tucked into the Appalachian foothills, had survived the winter of 1944 without losing a single resident to the privations that plagued rural America during wartime. While neighboring communities buried their elderly and watched their children grow thin from rationing shortages and a catastrophic early winter that had isolated the region for months, all 247 souls in Ashford Creek made it through to spring. Not one death from starvation or exposure. Not one. Wendell had written it as a testament to American resilience, to the leadership of Mayor Dalton Pruitt, to the community spirit that defined small-town America. He didn't yet know that in 2 weeks, he'd receive an envelope containing a confession that would destroy everything he thought he understood about that miraculous winter. A letter from an elderly woman who would tell him what really happened. And the truth would be so troubling that Wendell would never publish it. But he'd carry the burden until the day he died. To understand what truly transpired in Ashford Creek, you need to travel back 23 years, to the moment when desperation first showed its face. Winter arrived in Ashford Creek in early November 1943, and it came with hardship. This wasn't the usual Appalachian cold that folks wrapped themselves against with wool and stoked fires. This was the kind of cold that settled in your belly, a gnawing emptiness that no amount of blankets could warm. The war had already taken most of the able-bodied men overseas. The ones who remained were either too old, too young, or carrying wounds from the last war. The government's aggressive procurement policies had stripped local farms of everything that could feed soldiers abroad. Rationing was strict, but out here in the hollows, it wasn't just strict, it was strangling. By December, families were down to flour gravy and whatever they could trap in the woods. The deer had long since been hunted out. The rabbits grew scarce. People boiled tree bark to make tea that might settle their empty stomachs. Then the blizzards came. 3 in a row, each worse than the last. The roads became impassable. The railroad line that connected Ashford Creek to the county seat was buried under drifts 15 feet high. The town was cut off completely. No supply trucks, no mail, no communication, just snow and silence, and the slow realization that they were completely isolated. Vera Gaffney, a 52-year-old widow whose husband had died in the First War and whose only son was somewhere in the Pacific with the Marines, stood on her porch each morning and counted the smoke rising from chimneys around town. Smoke meant someone still had the strength to chop wood, to light a fire, to hold on. Every day there were fewer plumes. The Henderson place went dark 3 days ago. Vera knew what that meant. Old man Henderson and his wife had likely passed. Their daughter too, probably. Nobody had the energy to check. Walking through snowdrifts in sub-zero temperatures just to confirm what everyone already suspected seemed wasteful. Mayor Dalton Pruitt looked healthier than most, not because he was hoarding food, though everyone understood that leaders always had slightly better access to resources, but because he carried himself with determination. A tall man of 45 with shoulders like an ox and a face weathered by years of hard work, he moved through town with purposeful strides, checking windows, knocking on doors, keeping careful records of who was still breathing. He maintained detailed accounts of the living and the deceased. January 1944 was when things turned from bad to desperate. People stopped passing away one at a time and started dying in clusters. Children first, their small bodies unable to sustain the caloric deficit. Then the elderly, who seemed to slip away peacefully in their sleep. Then those in between who'd simply exhausted their reserves. Ashford Creek was dying, and everyone knew it. By February, folks figured the spring thaw would reveal a ghost town, another casualty of the war that history would barely mention. But then something happened. Though whether you could call it salvation depends on your perspective. February 14th, 1944, late afternoon, Silas Whitmore limped into the town hall. He was 37 years old, a former schoolteacher who'd come home from Europe in 1942, missing his right leg below the knee and carrying shrapnel injuries that left him with severe headaches and a slow, deliberate way of speaking. Before the war, he'd taught 8th grade English and coached the debate team. After, he couldn't stand at a blackboard for hours, couldn't handle the demands of teaching. He'd retreated into quieter work, spending his days repairing clocks and radios for neighbors, reading every book in his small personal library, and exploring the woods and ravines around town on his handmade crutches. People attributed it to what they called shell shock, though they said it quietly, with sympathy in their voices. Dalton Pruitt was hunched over his desk when Silas entered, trying to draft a report to the county supervisors that might bring help before it was too late. His hand trembled as he wrote, not from weakness, but from frustration. There was nothing he could write that would make a difference. What solutions existed when there was simply no food? "Dalton," Silas said slowly, leaning his crutches against the wall. "I need to speak with you, privately." The mayor looked up. The only other person in the office was Chester Boyle, the town clerk, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses who kept the municipal records. Dalton gestured toward the door, and Chester left without a word. "What is it?" Dalton asked. Silas took his time answering. His face carried the same drawn appearance everyone wore now, but his eyes held something Dalton hadn't seen in weeks, something that looked like hope. Silas said quietly. Dalton froze. The word had become almost sacred. He carefully set down his pen and stared at Silas intently. "Quote 8. Quote," he managed. "Quote 9. Quote. Quote 10. Quote." Dalton's voice was barely audible. "Canned goods. Meat, vegetables, soups. Hardtack, powdered milk, sugar. All in sealed crates. Military surplus that somebody stocked there and forgot about. Or maybe whoever knew about it died overseas. There's enough to feed this whole town until April, maybe May." The room fell silent except for the crackling of the wood stove. Outside, wind rattled the window frames. Dalton's mind was already racing through possibilities, calculating risks, weighing consequences. The part of his brain that had kept him alive in the trenches of France in 1918 activated. Cold, pragmatic, survival-oriented. He asked. Dalton stood and walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered Main Street, at the shuttered storefronts and the few figures moving like shadows between buildings. 1-5 Silas nodded. He'd expected exactly this response. Not joy, not relief. Caution, because both men understood that if word got out about this cash, complications would follow. The military could confiscate it. The county could redistribute it according to priority lists that wouldn't include Ashford Creek. There'd be paperwork, investigations, potential accusations. The town could lose everything. But understanding the danger and what actually happened next, there was a significant gap between those two things. The next morning, when the sky was still dark and stars glittered like ice chips, Dalton and Silas left town. They moved in silence, the mayor leading, the schoolteacher following on his crutches, breath fogging in the frigid air. Bald Ridge loomed against the pre-dawn sky, a massive silhouette of bare rock and skeletal trees. Beyond it, the ravine cut deep into the earth, choked with snow and brambles. Silas pointed to where the hillside had collapsed. Sure enough, the earth had given way, revealing a steel door set into living rock. The door hung half open where Silas had forced it with a crowbar the day before. Dalton stepped inside. Darkness enveloped him. Silas handed him a flashlight. Battery-powered, military issue, one of Silas's prized possessions. The beam swept across stacks of wooden crates marked with War Department stamps and stenciled inventory codes. Dalton pried open the nearest one. Inside, neatly arranged, were cans of preserved meat. He opened another. Condensed milk in small tins. A third held bags of rice sealed in waxed paper. Mayor Dalton Pruitt, a man who'd maintained his composure even when burying his own father after the old man's heart gave out that bitter December, suddenly felt overcome with emotion. He had to steady himself against the crates, because here, in this hidden storage space, was salvation. For the children who'd stopped playing because they lacked energy, for the elderly waiting to pass, for all 247 people who called Ashford Creek home. "How much is here?" he asked. "I estimated over a ton. Distributed carefully, it'll last until June." June. Dalton repeated the word like a prayer. They sat in the darkness, the flashlight beam wavering between them, both men thinking the same thoughts. How to do this without raising questions? How to explain a sudden food supply? And, most critically, how to ensure nobody reported it to authorities? "Listen carefully," Dalton said, rising to his feet. "We don't tell anyone where this came from. We say the county finally sent emergency supplies, delivered during the night, unloaded at the town storehouse. People will believe it because they need to believe it. They're too exhausted to ask detailed questions. We'll distribute it gradually, carefully, nothing excessive, just enough to survive." What if someone contacts the county, verifies the story? They won't. The roads are still impassable. Phone lines are down. By the time communications are restored, this will be old news. The key is keeping it simple. You say nothing. I say nothing. Everyone else is just grateful to be alive. Silas nodded slowly. The plan was straightforward. It could work, if they could maintain the secret. "But there's one condition," Dalton added, his voice becoming firm. "You don't show this place to anyone else. Ever. Not your sister, not your friends, not anybody. This stays between us. Understood?" "Understood," Silas agreed. What neither man articulated was the underlying question. What happens if someone does find out? But they pushed those thoughts aside because the alternative, watching the town perish, was unthinkable. Over the next 3 days, Dalton organized a small group of men he trusted completely. He told them the county had finally broken through with emergency supplies and needed help transferring provisions from a remote depot to the town center. He was vague about locations, citing confusion about routes due to snowdrifts. The men were too weak and too grateful to press for details. They moved crates in the pre-dawn darkness, working in shifts, and by the end of the 3rd day, the main storehouse behind the town hall was stocked with enough food to change everything. On February 18th, Dalton called a town meeting. The gathering hall was packed with thin faces and tired eyes. He announced that through his persistent efforts contacting state representatives and working his military connections, emergency provisions had been secured. The town erupted in tears of gratitude. People embraced each other. Some knelt in prayer. An elderly woman thanked Dalton and called him a hero. The distribution began immediately. Carefully rationed, scientifically calculated. Each family received just enough to sustain them without creating suspicion. Cans of meat, bags of rice, powdered milk for the children. The change was immediate and remarkable. Color returned to faces. Strength returned to bodies. The death rate, which had been climbing relentlessly, stopped. February ended with no new graves. March passed the same way. By April, when the spring thaw finally came and the roads reopened, Ashford Creek stood as a testament to American perseverance and leadership. The county supervisors were puzzled. They hadn't sent any emergency supplies. But when they questioned Dalton, he pointed to requisition forms he'd prepared, to his connections with a sympathetic officer at Fort Meade who he claimed had authorized the diversion. The paperwork was convincing enough, and frankly, nobody wanted to investigate too deeply. A town had survived. That was what mattered. Everyone was too busy dealing with the ongoing war and its countless challenges to examine the details of one small success. But Silas Whitmore knew the truth, and he carried it heavily. He'd saved his town, and the knowledge should have brought him peace. Instead, it brought sleepless nights and a growing sense of unease. Because secrets have weight, and this one was substantial. In late April, when spring was warming the hills and the town was celebrating its remarkable survival, Silas made a decision. He would tell one person. Just one. Someone he trusted absolutely, who deserved to know because they'd been part of managing the distribution. Vera Gaffney had worked alongside Dalton during the distribution, managing the inventory and ensuring fair allocation. She was respected, discreet, and had endured enough loss in her life that Silas thought she'd understand the burden of this secret. He invited her to his small house on the edge of town one evening, and over weak coffee, he told her everything. Vera listened in silence. When Silas finished, she was quiet for a long time, staring into her cup. She asked finally. Vera's expression was difficult to read. "You saved us, Silas. You found that cash, you showed it to Dalton, and because of you, we're all alive." "I know, but nothing. This town owes you everything." Silas felt relief wash over him. He'd been right to trust her. They talked for another hour, processing the magnitude of what had happened. When Vera left that night, Silas felt lighter than he had in weeks. What he didn't know was that Vera's mind was working differently. She'd spent the entire winter watching people die, including her closest friend's grandchild. She'd seen the desperation, the fear, the gradual acceptance of death. And now she understood that all of it could have been prevented if Silas had come forward sooner. Why had he waited? Why had he kept the discovery to himself for even a day? More troubling, she realized that if Silas had told her, he might tell others. And if word spread, if the authorities investigated, if the truth came out, the entire town could face consequences. Charges of theft, confiscation of property, public shame. The survival they'd achieved could be retrospectively destroyed. 2 days later, Vera went to see Mayor Dalton Pruitt. She told him about Silas's confession. She told him everything, framing it as a concern for the town's welfare. Dalton's face remained calm, but his mind was calculating rapidly. Silas had violated the one rule, the single condition that had made all of this possible. He'd shared the secret. And if he'd told Vera, might he tell others? His sister? A friend? Eventually, inevitably, someone would talk to the wrong person. The secret would spread. Investigations would begin. Questions would be asked. The forged paperwork would crumble under scrutiny. Dalton himself could face serious charges. But more than his own fate, Dalton thought about the town. If the truth emerged, Ashford Creek's reputation would be destroyed. Instead of heroes, they'd be thieves. Instead of a heartwarming story of survival, it would become a scandal. The shame would mark them forever. "Thank you for telling me, Vera," Dalton said quietly. "You did the right thing." That evening, Dalton visited Silas at his home. He brought a bottle of good whiskey and they drank together. Two men who'd shared an impossible secret. Quote 33, Dalton said conversationally. Silas's face went pale. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have. I needed someone to understand." "I do understand. That kind of weight. It's heavy." Dalton refilled their glasses. "But you see the problem, don't you? Once one person knows, others will follow. And then everything falls apart." "Vera won't tell anyone. I trust her completely." "I'm sure you do." Dalton sipped his whiskey. "But trust is fragile. People talk, Silas, even when they don't mean to. A word here, a hint there. Before you know it, the whole thing unravels." They talked deep into the night, and somewhere in that conversation, Dalton planted an idea. He suggested that perhaps Silas should visit the cache one more time to ensure everything was properly concealed, that the door was secured, that no evidence remained. It seemed prudent, cautious, responsible. The next morning, Silas took his crutches and headed for Bald Ridge. He didn't tell anyone where he was going. Why would he? This was just checking on their secret. He found the steel door exactly as they'd left it, hidden again by carefully arranged branches and debris. He went inside with his flashlight, checking the space thoroughly. The crates they hadn't moved were still there, stacked neatly. Everything was in order. He was about to leave when he heard sounds behind him. He turned. Dalton Pruitt stood in the doorway, his large frame blocking the exit. Behind him stood Vera Gaffney and two other men, Buck Henshaw and Amos Turley, both members of the town council, both men who'd helped move supplies. "Silas," Dalton said quietly, "I'm sorry." "What are you—" Silas began, but his words died as he saw their faces. He understood instantly. "You told," Dalton said. "You broke the rule. And now we can't trust that you won't tell others." "I won't, I swear." Silas backed deeper into the cache. "You already did," Vera said. "Once is enough to prove you can't keep silent." "We can't risk it," Buck added. "Too much is at stake." Silas looked at their faces. People he'd known his entire life, people he'd saved, and saw that they'd already made their decision. He said quietly. Dalton's jaw tightened. "The town survives, Silas. That's what matters." "I saved you," Silas said. "And we're grateful," Dalton replied. "But we can't let one person destroy what we've built." They backed out of the cache. Silas tried to follow, but Amos blocked his path. By the time Silas reached the entrance, they were outside, and the steel door swung shut with a heavy sound that echoed in the stone chamber. He heard the sound of equipment being moved, metal grinding on metal. They were sealing it, Silas called out, but his voice was absorbed by the stone walls. He tried the door, but it wouldn't budge. He was trapped. Outside, the four stood in silence as the reality of what they'd done settled over them. Vera's hands trembled. Buck looked uncomfortable. Amos stared at the ground. Dalton said quietly. Buck began. Dalton cut him off. They dispersed in different directions, each carrying their burden of what had just transpired. Within a week, the story was established. Silas Whitmore had packed a small bag and caught a ride out of town, heading for California where opportunities awaited. People were sad but understanding. Shell shock affected men in different ways, and Silas had always been somewhat solitary. Some folks said they'd expected it. His sister Nora reported him missing to the county sheriff, but the investigation was brief. Missing persons during wartime weren't unusual, and a troubled veteran leaving town wasn't cause for alarm. The case file was marked voluntarily departed and filed away. Inside the cache, Silas Whitmore's fate was sealed. The exact details of what happened in those final days remain unknown. He had no food. He had no water except minimal condensation. He had his flashlight until the battery died. Then, darkness. He used a piece of metal to scratch messages on the walls, messages that grew increasingly desperate. His final message, scratched low on the wall, was just 2 words. ___, quote, _ 61 ___. Eventually, he passed away in that darkness, alone. 20 years passed. Ashford Creek prospered. The story of their miraculous survival became local legend, then regional history, then a cherished part of the community's identity. Mayor Dalton Pruitt was elected to the state legislature in 1950. Vera Gaffney became the town librarian and was beloved by generations. Buck Henshaw ran the hardware store successfully. Amos Turley retired peacefully in 1963, surrounded by grandchildren. The town thrived, and everyone forgot Silas Whitmore except as a footnote, the troubled veteran who couldn't adjust to peacetime and left seeking something none of them could provide. Except Vera never forgot. Not really. The knowledge troubled her constantly. She'd go to church every Sunday and feel the weight pressing down on her. She'd volunteer for every charity drive, as if good works could balance the scales. She'd donate to veterans organizations, sponsor scholarships, but none of it helped. The guilt was persistent. By 1967, Vera was 76 years old and dying of cancer. She had perhaps 3 months left, the doctors said, and she couldn't pass away with this secret. Someone had to know the truth. She wrote the letter by hand, her writing shaky but legible. She addressed it to Wendell Hargrove at the Cumberland Valley Gazette because she'd read his article about Ashford Creek and knew he cared about truth. The letter explained everything. Silas's discovery, Dalton's plan, the distribution, Silas's confession to her, and what they'd done to silence him. She included details that only someone who'd been there could know. The exact location of the cache, how they'd sealed it, the story they'd created about Silas leaving town. She ended with a simple request. Please find him. Give him a proper burial. Don't let him lie there forgotten. He saved us all, and we repaid him with betrayal. I'll be gone soon, so I won't face justice in this life. But maybe you can give him justice in death. Wendell received the letter on a Tuesday afternoon. He read it multiple times. The details were too specific, too consistent. He checked archival records. Silas Whitmore had indeed disappeared in April 1944. There'd been a missing persons report, marked __quote_63__. The timing coincidence was striking. He drove to Ashford Creek and began asking quiet questions. Most people didn't remember Silas at all. He'd been gone over 20 years. But a few old-timers recalled him. Quote, 64, quote, they said. Quote, 65, quote. Wendell asked about Vera Gaffney. She was bedridden now, in hospice care. He went to see her. She was frail, diminished by disease, but her eyes were clear when she looked at him. Quote, 66, quote, she said. Quote, 67, quote. Quote, 68, quote. Wendell pulled up a chair beside her bed. Quote, 69, quote. She did. It took 2 hours with frequent pauses, but she told him everything. Details that hadn't been in the letter, the emotions she'd carried for 2 decades. When she finished, Wendell asked, quote, 70, quote, 71, quote, 72, quote, 73. She gave him directions, landmarks that had likely changed in 23 years, but enough to work with. Wendell spent the next week researching. He drove to the state capitol and examined military procurement records. He found documentation of a civil defense depot established in early 1942 near Ashford Creek, intended as an emergency supply point. It had been officially decommissioned in late 1942, but records from that period were incomplete. It was entirely plausible that a forgotten cache remained. On a cool morning in June, Wendell hiked out to Bald Ridge with equipment and supplies. He found the ravine exactly where Vera had described. After several hours of searching, he found it, a section of hillside that looked deliberately arranged. He cleared away debris and found the steel door, rusted but intact, sealed shut. He worked for hours to force it open. Inside, he found the evidence: broken crates, scattered supplies, and in the corner, human remains. Nearby lay rusted crutches, and on the wall, scratched messages. The final one, low on the wall, quote 74. Wendell stood there processing what he'd discovered. Then he left and went directly to the county sheriff's office. The investigation that followed was handled carefully. The sheriff and coroner retrieved the remains. Dental records confirmed the identity as Silas Whitmore. The sealed door and evidence told a clear story, but complications arose. Dalton Pruitt was deceased. So were Buck Henshaw and Amos Turley. The only living witness was Vera Gaffney, and she was dying. The prosecutor faced a difficult decision. They could charge Vera, but she'd pass away before trial. They could pursue posthumous investigation, but what purpose would that serve? The town's reputation would be destroyed. Families would suffer. Descendants would bear the shame of their ancestors' actions. After deliberation, the prosecutor made a controversial decision. He sealed the investigation files. Officially, Silas Whitmore had died under suspicious circumstances during the winter of 1944. Case details classified pending investigation. The body was released to his sister Nora for burial. The funeral was small. Nora, now in her 60s, grieved deeply. She'd spent 23 years believing he'd abandoned her. Now she knew he'd never left. He'd been less than 5 miles from town the entire time. Wendell wrote his article. He documented everything: Silas's discovery, the cache, the betrayal, the cover-up. He wrote about how a community chose collective survival over one man's life. He titled it, "The Price of Survival." He submitted it to his editor. His editor, Maxwell Cordry, read it carefully. Then he called Wendell into his office. "This is excellent reporting, Wendell. Thorough, honest, important. But I can't publish it." "Why not?" "Because it'll cause more harm than good. Not just to the guilty, they're dead, but to their children, grandchildren. The entire town will become synonymous with this tragedy. Is that justice?" "It's the truth." "Truth and justice aren't always aligned." Maxwell leaned back. "Vera Gaffney confessed because she wanted absolution. You found Silas's remains because you wanted answers. But publishing this won't change anything. It won't bring him back. It'll just spread the pain." Wendell wanted to argue, but something in Maxwell's words resonated. He thought about Nora Whitmore, who just learned her brother was murdered and now might see his story sensationalized. He thought about innocent families in Ashford Creek who had no connection to what happened. "So we just bury it again?" Wendell asked. "We document it, we preserve it, but we don't weaponize it." Maxwell pulled out a folder. "Write your story, complete, honest, thorough. Give it to me. I'll keep it in our archives. Maybe someday, when everyone involved is gone and enough time has passed, it can be published. But not now." Wendell went home and wrote the full story. Every detail, every interview, every piece of evidence. He wrote it as though it would be published, because he wanted future readers to understand not just what happened, but the context and complexity. When he finished, he sealed it along with all his research, Vera's letter and photographs. He gave it to Maxwell, who locked it in the newspaper's secure archive. Vera Gaffney passed away 3 weeks later. Her obituary praised her decades of service, her volunteer work, her kindness. It made no mention of the confession or the secret. The town continued its annual celebration of survival. Every year on February 18th, they held a commemoration. They raised the flag, sang songs, expressed gratitude. They spoke of resilience and community. They praised Mayor Pruitt's leadership and credited him with saving them all. Silas Whitmore's name wasn't mentioned. His grave in the town cemetery bore a symbol marker, __quote _86 __. Few visited. Within a generation, most people in town didn't remember who he was. But the land remembers. Somehow, places retain impressions. The ravine behind Bald Ridge became a place people avoided without really understanding why. Not consciously. If asked, they couldn't explain. Just an instinctive aversion, a sense of discomfort. Children playing nearby would sometimes report feeling uneasy. Hunters avoided setting up in that ravine. Hikers found themselves choosing different routes without quite knowing why. Local folklore developed gradually. The ravine became __quote _87 __. Though nobody could articulate exactly why. Just a collective understanding passed down through unspoken awareness. Wendell Hargrove lived another 36 years, dying in 2003 at age 78. His daughter Eleanor inherited his papers and found the sealed envelope marked __quote _88 __. She opened it, read everything, and sat for a long time in her father's study. She had a choice. She could finally publish her father's article, expose what happened, ensure Silas Whitmore received acknowledgement. Or she could continue the silence, protect innocent descendants, let the past rest. Eleanor drove to Ashford Creek. She walked through the town, seeing the prosperity, the maintained homes, the families. She visited Silas's grave and stood there contemplating. Then she returned home and made her decision. She burned the envelope and all its contents, watched the papers blacken and curl. She kept no copies. She told no one. Because she understood what her father and Maxwell Cordry had realized. Some truths don't heal. They just create more pain. Silas Whitmore had been wronged, but exposing that wrong wouldn't help him. It would only harm people who hadn't done anything wrong themselves. The truth was buried again, perhaps permanently. The official story survived. Ashford Creek's miraculous wartime survival, a testament to determination and community. It was taught in schools, referenced in histories, became part of regional identity. And perhaps that's how it should be. Not because truth doesn't matter, but because protecting the living sometimes matters more than vindicating the dead. But justice has a way of resurfacing. The cache behind Bald Ridge was never properly sealed after the investigation. Over decades, weather and erosion worked at the hillside. In 2019, another collapse revealed the entrance again. This time, it was found by high school students on a history project researching civil defense installations. They entered with phones and cameras, expecting historical artifacts. Instead, they found the scratched messages on the walls, the desperate words. That final message. They knew. The students reported their find to a local historian, who recognized the significance immediately. Within weeks, the story emerged, not as sensation, but as measured historical inquiry. Researchers accessed the sealed county files from 1967. Journalists tracked down Eleanor Hargrove's children, who knew nothing of their grandfather's work, but helped piece together the timeline. This time, the story was published. Not to shame Ashford Creek, but to understand how ordinary Americans faced impossible choices during crisis. The New York Times ran a feature titled, "The Hidden Cost of Wartime Survival." The Associated Press distributed it nationwide. Documentary producers showed interest. Ashford Creek faced its past. Some residents were defensive, angry that their legacy was being questioned. Others were thoughtful, acknowledging complexity. Many simply grieved for Silas Whitmore, whose sacrifice had enabled their town's existence. In 2020, the town council voted to rename the elementary school __quote _91 __. They erected a memorial at the cache site with a plaque explaining what happened. They established an annual scholarship for veterans, naming it in Silas's honor. It wasn't enough. It could never be enough. No recognition can balance the scales when one life is traded for many, when trust is repaid with betrayal, when heroes die forgotten. But it was something. An acknowledgement. A reckoning, decades late but genuine. The story of Ashford Creek transformed from simple resilience tale to a more complex narrative about survival, betrayal, and the stories communities tell themselves. It became a case study in ethics courses, a subject of historical analysis, a reminder of how desperate circumstances can lead good people to terrible choices. And through it all, Silas Whitmore's name endured. Not as a forgotten casualty, but as someone who mattered, someone whose life and death had meaning, someone who deserved to be remembered. That ravine behind Bald Ridge was permanently sealed after 2019, filled with concrete. But the earth knows what happened there. The stone walls remember. The space remembers. Some places never fully heal. They carry impressions that run deep, marks that never quite fade. The ravine is one such place. Even now, people report an unsettling feeling when nearby. A heaviness, a sense of unfinished business. Ashford Creek continues to exist. It's still a small town, though larger now. People are born there, live there, pass on there. Children play in streets. Families gather for holidays. Life continues, as it always does, because that's what life does. But February 18th isn't celebrated anymore. The annual commemoration was quietly discontinued after the truth emerged. Some traditions, once their foundations are exposed, can't be maintained. You can't celebrate survival built on betrayal, at least not openly. Instead, On that date each year, a small group gathers at Silas Whitmore's grave. They lay flowers. They read his name aloud. They remember not just that he saved them, but the cost. It's a different kind of commemoration, one rooted not in triumph, but in humility and regret. That's the real story of Ashford Creek. Not heroism and miracle, but complexity and moral challenge. Not simple good versus evil, but the difficult reality of humans pushed to extremes. Not a tale with easy lessons, but a narrative with only questions. What would you have done? If you'd been Dalton Pruitt, would you have chosen differently? If you'd been one of the 247 saved, would you want to know? If you'd been Silas Whitmore, would you have trusted your neighbors? There are no comfortable answers. That's what makes the story so difficult. Everyone acted according to their own logic, their own needs, their own moral calculations. And the result was tragedy for which no one was adequately held accountable, and no one could be adequately forgiven. Silas died alone, betrayed by those he saved. That fact stands unchangeable. Nothing that happened afterward, not Vera's confession, not Wendell's investigation, not the town's eventual reckoning, changes that fundamental reality. We can only imagine his final thoughts. Did he pray? Did he rage? Did he understand? We'll never know. Those are secrets he carried into darkness. But we can reflect, and that's perhaps the story's most important gift. We can consider the terror and disbelief, the gradual realization, the final acceptance. That's the price Ashford Creek paid for survival, not in money or resources, but in one man's life. And the question that echoes through decades is, was it worth it? The town says yes. 247 lives saved, countless descendants who exist because their ancestors survived, a community that endured. The arithmetic seems clear. But arithmetic can't capture everything. It can't measure suffering. It can't weigh moral corruption against practical benefit. It can't balance scales in any way that satisfies both logic and conscience. So we're left with an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes survival requires difficult choices. Sometimes good people do harmful things. Sometimes the only difference between hero and villain is whose story gets told. Silas Whitmore was both savior and victim, celebrated and erased. His story is America's story in microcosm, full of noble sacrifice and terrible betrayal, of survival purchased at high cost, of truths we'd rather not face but cannot fully escape. And like all true stories, it offers no comfort, only complexity, only questions, only the knowledge that we are all capable of both great good and profound wrong, sometimes in the same moment, sometimes for the same reasons. Ashford Creek survived. That matters to those who live there now, who walk its streets and raise families and build futures. The past is past. The living matter more than the dead. Tomorrow matters more than yesterday. But Silas Whitmore died for that tomorrow. Died alone. Died betrayed. Died unmourned and forgotten for decades. And now you know. Just like Wendell Hargrove knew. Just like Vera Gaffney knew. Just like everyone in Ashford Creek eventually knew. And the knowing changes nothing and everything simultaneously. Because some truths, once learned, cannot be unlearned. They become part of you, something you carry forward. A reminder that history is never simple, never just a story to feel good about. We are the children of survivors and the children of those who made terrible choices. We are inheritors of both courage and moral failure. We are the ones who must decide what to do with the knowledge that our existence might rest on foundations we'd prefer not to examine too closely. That's the final lesson of Ashford Creek. Not that people are good or evil, not that survival justifies any means, not that truth will set you free. Just that we're human, complex, capable of saving and destroying, choosing life and dealing loss, building monuments and creating tragedies. And sometimes, The only honest response to that reality is to stand in the quiet places where the past still speaks and listen to what the silence says. It says, "This happened. This was real. This mattered." It says, "Remember." It says, "Learn." And most important, it asks, "What would you have done?" That question has no answer, but perhaps asking it is enough.